This is question 15 on problem solving from section 1 of the 2019 ECAA. So we're told that someone is organising an end of term treat for their school year, and this is the results of the votes. We've got votes for the theme park, steam train, adventure playground, farm and museum. We're given 5 different options for the breakdown of the votes in terms of the raw numbers, and we're asked which one of these rows could show the correct numbers of votes. So this isn't an obvious question, so they've not given us any sort of obviously wrong sets of votes. So for example, adventure playground is always higher than steam train, and now we're getting towards the end of the paper, we're going to have to think a little bit harder about how we can do this. So how do we deal with a pie chart in general? Well, maybe it's best to just choose some of these sections and see if they match the rough proportion that we're given in here. And what would be a good section to choose? Well, our eyes naturally are able to recognize right angles and straight lines, and it looks like the adventure playground section is roughly 90 degrees. This is quite a recognizable angle. And to make this a bit clearer, maybe we could extend this line across the whole way. And then we can see how close to 90 degrees this bisects this line. And we can see that it's maybe slightly more in this direction, which would mean that it's slightly smaller than 90 degrees. And so what does that mean for the proportion? The adventure playground, we can confidently say, is just under a quarter of the votes. So we've managed to find quite a specific requirement for the voting breakdown. We need the adventure playground votes to be just under a quarter of the total. So let's see if this is the case in each of the options. So what's a quarter of 180? Half would be 90, and half of 90 is 45. We can see here that 45 is exactly a quarter, but we know, we've already seen, that this line does not go directly in the middle of this section, and therefore it's just under a quarter, and we know that this can't be correct. What about B? So 28 out of 120, is that just under a quarter? Well, a quarter would be 30, and this looks pretty good in that regard, so let's keep B for now. What about C? Is 55 just under a quarter of 200? So this is actually just over a quarter. A quarter of 200 is of course 50. So we know it can't be C. What about D? Well, again, like we had in B, we've got 28 out of 120, which we know is just under a quarter. Then finally for E, we've got 36 out of 150. What's a quarter of 150? So that's half of 75 is 37.5. And indeed, 36 is just under 37.5. So we know it can't possibly be A or C, but at the moment it could be B, D, or E. So now we've used this requirement as much as we can. Let's come up with a new rule. So can we do something similar with any of these? Well, maybe you can spot something, but personally I'd have gone for the theme park votes looking like it's about a third. How can we make this even clearer? Well, if we try and draw a line that completely bisects this angle in the other direction across the circle, like so, we don't have to be too accurate, but making sure this angle is about the same as this angle. Does it look like this has been split perfectly into 3? So it looks pretty good, but it looks a bit like these sections that we've made are a bit larger than this section. And so it looks like this is just under a third, but maybe it's not quite as obvious as just under a quarter. Again, our eyes can't see this angle of 120 degrees as we can see the angle of 90 degrees. But this is a fair assumption for now. So can we get rid of any of these options based on this rule? So we're looking at the theme park votes. Is 32 just under a third of 120? So a third will be 40, and it looks like this is a little bit too small. This is closer to a quarter, and we can see this definitely isn't a quarter of the votes, and so we can get rid of B confidently. So now it's between D and E. So 40 out of 120, we can see is exactly a third. And if we're not too sure if it is just under, or if we've just drawn our diagram maybe slightly inaccurately, let's not get rid of this for now. And let's look at E quickly. So 48 out of 150, well, a third would be 50, and indeed 48 is just under. So it looks like E might be more accurate. Is there anything else we can do to make sure? Because again, there's not much in it. Well, let's look at D, if we think this is the one that might be wrong. Is there anything distinguishing about these votes that we can also use to pick out anything wrong? Well, we can see that the farm votes and the museum votes are both exactly the same, 15. And that should be fairly easy to spot. And indeed, it looks like the farm votes should be quite a bit higher than the museum votes, which we can see in all the other options. And so, based on those two reasons, we can definitely rule out D. So, we've narrowed it down to just E. And so let's quickly look at the values and see if they're sensible, just in case we've made any mistakes. So we've got the highest for the theme park, just under a third. Then it's the adventure playground, just under a quarter, which is correct. Then the steam train, which is just under the adventure playground. The farm, quite a bit smaller than that, yes, and the museum, slightly smaller than the farm. And so we can say that E must have the correct breakdown of votes, and therefore this is our final answer.